Good morning, Bright City. My name is Mallory. I volunteer on the liturgical team and on the guest services team, and we are so excited you're here today. Here at Bright City, we exist to help people take their next step towards Christ, and ultimately, we want to see our community restored to God, restored to others, and restored to themselves. If this is your first time joining us today, welcome. We are really excited that you're here, and we would love to connect with you. There's a few different ways you can do that. One, there are some cards throughout cup holders, and you can fill out your information and hand it to anybody wearing a black t-shirt on your way out. Also, you can scan that QR code and click New here and fill out that same information on your phone. Additionally, today, after the 10:30 service, which is right now, we will be doing something called Pizza with the Pastors. So this is a time where once a month, Ike and Sharon head over to California Pizza Kitchen after the service for an opportunity to get to know you, answer any questions you may have, and just connect with the community. So if this is your first time, or if you've been coming for a few weeks and you're interested in getting to know Bright City and getting to know Ike and Sharon a little bit better, head over to California Pizza Kitchen after the service. But if you're going to go, we'd love to know that you're coming. So go ahead and scan the QR code and RSVP. So that way we have enough pizza and chairs for everybody. Additionally, this coming Saturday, we'll be doing something called Pray First. So Saturday, October 15th at 9 a.m., we will be meeting as a community to just pray over our city, pray over the South Point area, and just spend that time together in prayer. So if you would like to come, join us Saturday, October 15th, 9 a.m., bring your coffee, and we'd love to see you there. There are a few other ways that you can also get involved in the life of our church, and that's through giving and serving. So we view giving as an act of worship and as a way that we tangibly demonstrate the priority of God in our life. So if you're interested in taking that next step at Bright City, there are two different ways you can do that. One, you can scan the QR code and click Give, or you can head over to brightcitychurch.com/give and set up automatic monthly giving. Additionally, through serving is a way to get to participate in the life of our church. And, serving is the way that we fulfill God's mission for a fully functional church. And there are opportunities for everybody to serve and to get involved. For me, I have really enjoyed serving. It's a way that I've connected with my community and feel closer to the church and closer to God through serving. So if you are interested in getting plugged in that way, go ahead and scan the QR code and click Serve. And we will get you plugged in whatever capacity you're interested. Lastly, one more announcement. Today is National Pastor Appreciation Day. Woo! So we have 3 incredible pastors here at Bright City that we would like to celebrate today. So first, Ike and Sharon, thank you so much for what you do for Bright City. If you were not willing to lay down the plan you had for your own life and say yes to what God was calling you to, Bright City would not exist. And Ike and Sharon, they lead and they preach and they disciple out of the depth of their relationship of God. And we are just really lucky to learn from you week after week, and really lucky and thankful and grateful to be in community with you. Additionally, Alex and his wife Lexi, they do so much for Bright City as well. So many seen and unseen things and ways that they're involved. So much more than just leading incredible worship up here on Sundays, but they plug into community, they disciple, they're relationship builders, and we're really thankful to also be in community with them. So big thank you to Ike, Sharon, and Alex. And if you'd like to extend your gratitude, we have some cards in the lobby. That table will be set up after the service, and you can head over there, write a little note for thank you. Don't tell them, it's a secret. And then also, if you are listening online and you'd like to share your gratitude, you can email church@brightcitychurch.com and send a note of appreciation that way as well. So I think with that, we will pass it over to Samantha for the reading of Scripture. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Samantha, and I serve on the welcome and liturgical teams at Bright City. Whether you're new or you've been here for a while, I want to remind you that we practice the communal reading of God's Word, because we believe what forms us is not our beliefs but our habits. If you're able, I invite you to stand for the reading of God's Word. When Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, "David is in the wilderness near En-Gedi." So Saul took 3,000 of Israel's fit young men and went to look for David and his men in front of the rocks of the wild goats. When Saul came to the sheep pens along the road, a cave was there, and he went in to relieve himself. David and his men were staying in the recesses of the cave. So they said to him, "Look, this is the day the Lord told you about. I will hand your enemy over to you so you can do to him whatever you desire." Then David got up and secretly cut off the corner of Saul's robe. Afterward, David's conscience bothered him because he had cut off the corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, "As the Lord is my witness, I would never do such a thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed. I will never lift my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed." With these words, David persuaded his men, and he did not let them rise up against Saul. Then Saul left the cave and went on his way. After that, David got up, went out of the cave, and called to Saul, "My lord, the king." When Saul looked behind him, David knelt low with his face to the ground and paid homage. David said to Saul, "Why do you listen to the words of people who say, 'Look, David intends to harm you'? You can see with your own eyes that the Lord handed you over to me today in the cave. Someone advised me to kill you, but I took pity on you and said, 'I won't lift my hand against my Lord, since he is the Lord's anointed.' Look, my father, look at the corner of your robe in my hand, for I have cut it off, but I didn't kill you. Recognize that I have committed no crime or rebellion. I haven't sinned against you, even though you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between me and you, and may the Lord take vengeance on you for me, but my hand will never be against you." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, Samantha. You guys can have a seat. Well, it is good to be with you guys this morning. I don't know about you, but when I went outside this morning for the first time, it was a little chilly. It kind of was like shocking. Anybody else? It's kind of nice, right, to have that little nip in the air. But as I got to church this morning, I thought, you know what, this is a good morning for us to bring out our Bright City sweatshirts. And so if you don't have one of those, I wanted to let you know that they are, first of all, amazing. But second of all, we do have those for sale in the lobby if you want one. We also have some beanies, but would invite you to check those out. They are amazing. But yeah, this week we are continuing our series, The Fall of Saul and the Fall of Us All, as we walk through these last few chapters of the book of 1 Samuel that we've been in for pretty much most of this year with a few breaks. But for those that are new with us in this last section of 1 Samuel, we're looking at King Saul, who was the first king of Israel. This was about 1,000 years BC, and looking at really kind of what led to his downfall. What were the things in his life, in his character, that led to a downfall? And the surprising thing as we look at these is how radically relevant these are to our lives, how they continue to be true because of our human experience, regardless of time in history. And so as we continue to walk through this, we've looked at, over the last few weeks, jealousy and comparison, and how that was eating Saul up from the inside, how his fears about David were driving him to certain behaviors. We talked about how toxic behavior and Saul's behavior had become toxic, and what do we do when people around us have toxic behavior? How do we know if we are beginning to demonstrate toxic behavior? And this week we are talking about another aspect that I think is a good follow-up to the conversation around toxic behavior, because I think a lot of us left wondering, okay, maybe I have some of these tendencies. Maybe this is something that I do. What do I do about that? And so this week we're going to look at something that I think really is a good counterpart to doing some work in that area. But to recap the story as we've heard it, basically Saul has been out fighting the Philistines, and it's almost like anytime Saul is between wars, he's going after David. It just seems like anytime he's got a spare moment, it's like, let's go get David. And so he finds out where David is, and they go after him in this particular area, and nature calls, and so Saul has to go into this cave to relieve himself, and lo and behold, this is also the cave where David and his men are hiding. What are the chances of that, right? And so his men are like, look, David, God is putting Saul into your hands. He has handed him over to you. This is your chance to go and kill him and take the throne. But David, in his integrity, says, I will not raise my hand against the Lord's anointed, and refuses to do this and talks his men down. In fact, it says that he kind of tears his men apart with his words, like, I will not do this, I refuse to do this. And so he goes and cuts a little bit of Saul's robe. Saul finishes his business, goes out of the cave. David comes out after him and is basically like, look, I don't know how else to say to you that I'm not here to hurt you. I'm not trying to take the throne from you. And shows him the cloth. And finally, Saul has this moment of awareness of, oh my goodness, you are right. You are more righteous than I am. You will surely be the next king of Israel. And this moment, unfortunately, doesn't last. Saul goes back on his rampage. But for a moment, there is this moment of awareness and clarity. But what I want to talk about this week and what we see in Saul this week that we have seen kind of all throughout Saul's existence in this story is that Saul has no awareness of his own interior world. He has no awareness of what's going on inside his emotional world, his spiritual world. And one aspect of this is something that we hear more in psychological contexts, but it's this language of self-awareness and having self-awareness. And the scary thing about self-awareness, I don't know if you've ever thought about this before, but when we lack self-awareness, what that means is there's things that other people know about us that we don't know about ourselves. Isn't that kind of scary? Right? One of my first kind of experiences of this was probably 4th or 5th grade, and my childhood best friend, we went to church together, we grew up going to church together, we were in school together, we were inseparable. But one day we were at my house and we were playing hockey, and we just got into it. We got into an argument. I think we were throwing pucks at each other. I may or may not have hit him with a hockey stick. I cannot confirm or deny. But as we were arguing, he said something that I was like, that is not true. He goes, you are moody. And I was like, that is not true. But it haunts me to this day because I'm like, it was true. It was so true. But kind of this moment where you realize, oh man, other people can see things in me that I cannot see in myself. And so you have these moments where the scales just kind of fall off your eyes and you're like, oh my goodness. I can finally see this with clarity for myself. And so a definition of self-awareness would be something like self-awareness is the recognition of one's own emotional state at any given point in time. Sort of the ability to determine in the moment where you are emotionally and what's going on. Another definition would be conscious knowledge of one's own character, feelings, motives, and desires. Why am I behaving the way I'm behaving right now? What's driving my action? Why am I responding this way? Why am I so upset about this? And so this self-awareness is just a part of it, but it's more holistic than this, and we'll get into that in a minute. But the reason that this matters, you may be thinking, okay, what does this psychology lesson have to do with faith and Jesus and all of those things? But there's a couple of things that make this important. The first is that when we lack self-awareness, when we're unaware of what's going on in our interior world, then we will continue to struggle with the same demons over and over again. The same things will continue to plague us because we're not aware of why they're functioning the way they are and what we can do about it. The second thing is that this lack of awareness will impact our relationships, and we will be unaware of how our own actions and behaviors are continuing to cause discontent and problems in our relationships. But most importantly, if you set all of those things aside, one of the reasons that this matters so much is because I think many of us, or some of us, are undermining our witness to Jesus by our lack of self-awareness. Our inability to see how we are treating others, how we're responding to others, how we respond to others when they disappoint us, when they wrong us, when we're angry, how we respond. We can talk about Jesus all day long, but our behavior is undermining the things that we're saying about Jesus. And so if you set aside all of the relational and personal stuff, there's a very missional-minded focus behind this. By our lack of self-awareness, are we undermining our own witness to Jesus? This idea of self-awareness has become sort of a virtue in our culture. We kind of disdain the people that we see as less self-aware than we are. And we look down on them. It's kind of this pedestal that we stand on and look down on others from. And so there's this irony that begins to happen where we become arrogant about our self-awareness, right? And so we look down on others, but then we become blind to our arrogance about our self-awareness. And at this point, you're like defeating the point, like you're cyclical. And so what started out as a good thing has actually begun to damage our relationships as well. And so that's why it's got to be more than just self-awareness. This is a whole investigation of our interior worlds. This awareness is not just about our emotions and motivations. It's our thoughts about ourselves, our thoughts about others, our thoughts about God, our thoughts about what God thinks about us. It's our plans, our hopes. It's the impacts of trauma that we carry with us. It's our biases. It's the baggage that we carry from broken relationships. And so this work of attending to our interior world is also where we attend to our life with God. That this is where we attend to our life with God and allow God to come in and do the transforming work that we have talked about for a long time in the church of God doing. But our own unwillingness to engage our interior world is keeping that transformation from happening. And so this morning, here's how I want you to think about this passage. I am not going to go verse by verse as much as I normally do, but I want you to think about this passage as a whole and think about these events of Saul going into this cave and it not knowing what's going on, it being so dark that he can't even tell that David has clipped off a part of his robe. I want you to think about this as a metaphor for Saul's awareness of his interior life. That the cave is a metaphor of Saul's interior life. And that when Saul goes to look into his interior life, it is so dark, he can't see anything, he doesn't know what's going on in there. And then the great irony of this is the way that he is acting outside of the cave is a direct result of his lack of awareness of what's going on inside the cave. And so his emotional world is like a dark cave that he doesn't know what's going on in and doesn't know how that's contributing to his actions towards David outside and in his external world. He has no idea what's going on. And so this morning I want to look at three things that happen when we don't examine our internal world and things that we see with Saul, but that are also true of us. The first thing is we do not examine our internal worlds. When we don't examine our internal worlds, we lose touch with reality. When we look at Saul in this story, and David has over and over and over again tried to communicate to Saul that he is not out to get him, he does not want to kill him, and yet Saul has never stopped to examine his own motivations of like, why am I really pursuing David? What is driving this behavior? And more importantly, is it based in reality? The reality that we see in this story is David's like, here, I've clipped off a bit of your robe. I could have killed you if I wanted to. But because he is so driven and unaware of what's going on inside of him, he also doesn't realize how out of reality, out of touch with reality he is. And in a book that Dan Allender and Tremper Longman wrote called The Cry of the Soul, they write this. They say, ignoring our emotions is turning our back on reality. Listening to our emotions ushers us into reality. And reality is where we meet God. Emotions are the language of the soul. They are the cry that gives the heart a voice. However, we often turn a deaf ear through emotional denial, distortion, or disengagement. We strain out anything disturbing in order to gain tenuous control of our inner world. We are frightened and ashamed of what leaks into our consciousness. In neglecting our intense emotions, we are false to ourselves and lose a wonderful opportunity to know God. We forget that change comes through brutal honesty and vulnerability before God. A little bit of what they are getting at here is the fact that I think many of us sort of treat God as this theoretical construct, this idea out there that we know things about because we've read our Bibles, we know theology, but in reality, God feels quite distant. And I think a part of that is because in the moments where we find ourselves in pain, we find ourselves experiencing some grief, God still feels theoretical because we haven't opened our lives to allow God to come in. We haven't evaluated our emotions in God's presence, said, God, what is happening in this moment? What are you doing in this moment? How do I experience intimacy with you in this moment? And so God continues to feel distant rather than us being honest and vulnerable before God with what's going on in our hearts. We see in the New Testament that Jesus regularly took time away for silence and solitude. We see that Jesus goes away to pray, is what scriptures say. But scripture is so much more than just talking to God. Prayer is inviting God into our interior world. And this can be terrifying because some of us have never actually taken that step to invite God into our interior world. And in fact, we may have used this approach to prayer of talking to God to avoid the more vulnerable, direct work of opening our lives and our emotional worlds to God, to evaluate those in His presence. And we do that not just to allow God to come and to judge us and to feel guilty, but we do that so that God can come in and help us to see what needs healing. One of the things that I find a really helpful kind of statement around this is that painful thoughts and feelings don't die just because we bury them. I don't know how many of you are into yard work this time of year. Anybody doing the yard thing? One of the things that I've battled with this year, and I don't know if anybody else has battled with this, has been moles, like worse than ever before. And if you go in my yard, there are these tunnels everywhere where these moles have burrowed little tunnels just below the surface. And the fact is, this whole summer, I have not seen one single mole. Like, I've not actually seen the mole itself. And so if I wanted to, I could deny the reality that there are moles in my backyard. But when you walk across my backyard, there is no denying that there have been moles there because you can feel the soil just give under your feet. And I think a lot of us want to just pretend like those painful thoughts and feelings aren't there, deny the reality of them. But what we can't deny is their continual impact on our lives, how it continues to show up in our relationships, continues to show up in our thoughts about ourselves. And so what happens is when we distance ourselves from those things, we distance ourselves from reality and distance ourselves from an opportunity to connect with God in a deeply honest and vulnerable way. The second thing is when we do not examine our interior world, we are unable to see how it impacts our external worlds. When we lack awareness of what's going on inside of us, we also tend to lack awareness of our impact on others. In this story, Saul obviously is chasing David all over the place, and David is constantly on the run from him. But there's a part of me that wonders, does Saul realize that he is driving his most valuable military leader, his strongest, most valiant military leader, to hide in caves? Is he aware of the impact that he is having on David? Are there people in our lives that we think are strong and resilient when in fact they are cowering in caves because of the fear that we inspire in them? Or are there people that we think we're good with, right? Like everything's good, everything is going well, we're fine, but they in fact have had to distance themselves from us because of some toxic behavior in our life that we're not aware of? I've been reading a book recently called Anatomy of the Soul. It's written by a psychiatrist named Kurt Thompson, and it's just a powerful book about how really our brain chemistry is connected with our emotions and ultimately connected with our spiritual lives. He's a Christian, and so it talks about how God meets us in the midst of all of how that works together. And in this book, he tells the story of a father named George who comes to see him because he's recently had a couple of episodes where he had to go and actually pick up his daughter from a party where she had drunk herself to unconsciousness. And so they were coming to see this psychiatrist to figure out what he could do, how he could help them. And so the daughter, she's 16, she begins to meet with him. And in their conversation, she shares about how much pressure she feels like she is under, how much pressure she feels like she is under academically to perform so that she can get into the college that she wants to get into, to perform athletically so that she can get the scholarship to go to the college that she wants to. And eventually she becomes very transparent about the fact that a lot of this pressure is coming from her dad and the pressure that he's putting on her to perform in all of these areas. Well, Dr. Thompson would regularly meet with her parents to share updates about how things were going. And in the middle of one of these conversations and updates, Dr. Thompson asks George, the father, about his anxiety. What are you anxious about? What are the things that you're worried about? And all he could talk about were the things that he worried about with his daughter, about whether she was going to perform academically, whether she was going to perform athletically to get into the school that she wanted to get into. He was incapable of looking at his own interior world to be honest for a moment about what he was honestly afraid of. And so because he was blind to his own internal world, he could not see that he was the one who was putting the very pressure on his daughter that was driving her to the kinds of actions that he was trying to prevent. He was blind to his own internal world and how it was impacting his own children. Finally, the last thing is when we do not examine our interior world, we struggle to see and experience God. As I was talking with someone this week, they asked how I deal with circumstances where I find myself asking, God, why did this happen? What do I do in those moments? And I said, I don't do this perfectly. I'm still growing in this, and surely there are things that could happen where I wouldn't do this quite as well. But one of the things that I've learned to do and try to do is instead of in those moments asking, why God, instead asking, God, what are you up to in this? And I say I've made that shift because one is demanding an explanation. God, you need to give me an explanation. The other comes from a posture of trust of God. I know that you're at work in this. I know that there's something you're going to do in this, that you are a God of redemption. And so help me to see, help me to learn what you're doing. And it's also a posture that says, God, I know you're present. Help me to see and experience your presence. And the reason that this matters is because it's not in the grand theological ideas that we have that God shows up. Yes, he does. But really where God meets us are in the real life moments. The day-to-day lived life that God shows up and meets us in the most intimate and personal ways. And when we're not aware of what's going on inside of us, it's really difficult for us to be aware of how God is present to us in that as well. We have seen this in so many ways throughout 1 Samuel, where Saul is just oblivious to what God is doing, unable to see how God is at work in this, unable to see that David is going to be the next king regardless of what Saul does. He is consumed with, what does Saul need to do right now? How do I maintain military power? How do I win this battle? And so when we see David say, I will not lift my hand against the Lord since he is the Lord's anointed, it wasn't out of respect for Saul that he did that, but it was because of his conviction that God is present and active in everything. And so when it's time for Saul's reign to end, God will be the one that brings about that end. That won't happen because David takes advantage of Saul in a weak moment. It's going to happen when it is God's desired time. And so we see that contrasted with Saul, who is just consumed by political and military motives, completely void of God and awareness of God. And so what I'm saying in all of this is that our awareness of God is severely inhibited by our unwillingness to know ourselves, our unwillingness to be aware of what's going on in our interior worlds. St. Augustine, writing in the 4th and 5th century, said, how can you draw close to God when you are far from yourself? And so he prays this prayer. He says, grant, Lord, that I may know myself, that I may know thee. St. Teresa of Avila says, almost all problems in the spiritual life stem from a lack of self-knowledge. What she's getting at there is the simple statement that how can we know what to ask God to help work through in us when we don't even really know what's going on inside of ourselves? What I want you to know is that this work to be aware of what's going on in our internal worlds is not new. This is not some recent psychological development that we've said, oh, this could be helpful for our spiritual lives. This is something that has been a part of the Christian tradition since the beginning, of being a people who do this reflective work on ourselves in God's presence. One person who did this well, that created a practice that I think continues to be really important, is a man named St. Ignatius of Loyola. He was a Spanish priest and theologian. He helped to establish the Jesuit order, and he established this practice called the daily examen. And this was a habit of twice a day pausing to examine our lives, to examine our interior worlds, to examine the events of our day in God's presence. And each of these examines begin with the same preparatory prayer, something like this: God our Lord, grant me the grace that all my intentions, actions, and operations may be directed purely to the service and praise of His divine majesty. And part of this examine was to be able to acknowledge, how can we know if our intentions are directed to God's service if we haven't stopped long enough to think about what our intentions are in the first place, of what's really going on in the first place. And so I want to walk you through this practice. We've got a kind of a graphic that lays this out, and encourage you to take a picture of this so that you have it. But it's kind of a 5-step process that just begins with becoming aware of God's presence. Whether you feel God is present or not, just beginning with the truth that God is present. And then to begin to reflect on your day. What is one thing that you're grateful for? And then to reflect on one thing that needs prayer. What is an aspect of the day that you need God to speak into, to move in, something you need God's assistance with? And then to pay attention to your emotions, of what's going on internally. Why did you respond that way? Why are you so upset about that situation? Why can you not stop thinking about? Why can you not stop worrying about what's going on? And then lastly, looking toward tomorrow. What do you need to do to prepare for the conversations of the next day? How can God help you prepare for the next day? One of the tools that I've found extremely helpful, especially in paying attention to my emotions in my internal world, is called the 5 whys. And I've shared this before, so I'm not going to give the long version of it, but this is something that started in Toyota car factories, and I know you're thinking like, what? What does that have to do with emotions? But this was their way of diagnosing a problem. And if there was something wrong on the factory floor, they would go to the person where the issue was, and they would ask, why is this happening? And after they gave their answer, they would say, well, why is that happening? And then why is that happening? And by the time you ask the 5th why, you've answered your first question. And so I've adopted that to investigate my own interior world. And so to give you an example of what this looks like, let's say, for example, I've had a conversation with someone where it made me really angry. And so I might sit down and say, okay, God, help me to investigate what's going on in my internal world. Why am I so angry about this? And so I might say, well, I'm angry about it because I felt insulted by what they said. Well, why did I feel insulted about it? Well, because it felt like they were talking down to me. Well, why is it hurtful that they were talking down to you? Well, because I want to appear intelligent. I want to appear smart, and it felt condescending. Well, why do you want to appear intelligent? And by this point, you're starting to get to like the real issue, which is, well, I find my identity in being intelligent, of coming across intelligent. And so I felt in this moment, I got angry because a core part of how I saw myself was called into question. And so you assess layers down till you get to some of the root things. That you could have that conversation 1,000 times and say, okay, this time I'm not going to get angry, but until you address what's down at the root of it, you're going to respond the same way. And so I invite you to begin to do that work in your own life. What's going on layers down, inviting God's Spirit to help you see with new eyes what's going on in your interior world. And so I want to invite you to just close your eyes. We're going to take a moment to pray, to reflect, to do some of this assessment work before we go time of worship and communion. God, this morning we just want to open our interior worlds to you. God, we invite you to come into the storm of emotions that just is always spiraling inside of us. God, we just invite you to speak to that storm and say, be still. Be still. Be Be still so that we can really see what's going on in the storm. Things that are swirling and spiraling. Things that are eating us alive. Things that are destroying our relationships. Things that are getting in the way of us seeing God with clarity and what He's doing in our lives. What do you need God to speak to this morning? What do you need God to, what do you need to thank God for this morning? What are the pain points that you need to take some time to reflect on, to know and understand what's really going on? God, would you help us this morning to see ourselves so that we can see you? God, would you help us to get in touch with the reality on the inside of us so that we can experience your reality in a profoundly personal and powerful way. God, send your Spirit into us this morning.